Welcome back to the CultureRoad podcast. I'm Lexi Seals-Johnson, and today, episode 6, we'll be talking about burning it down versus anchoring to aspiration. If you want to know what that means, stay tuned for more. People have the language and knowledge of abolition and abolishing systems that are only making incremental changes, and they're again tired, exhaustion. They're we have to get rid of, and they want it in a radical way, of the things that are oppressing people.
So I think a lot of people before us felt this is my place, and this is where I have been, and this is where my family has been, and I feel good being here. Whereas I think a lot of others are no, I'm going to be an innovator. We grew up in the age of technology.
There's something ridiculously substantive that people are calling for, and they're calling for it at a global level. And if we don't listen to it, we might actually be standing in the ashes. We're back from the Redlands Koi Gardens in Miami, Florida. Love, love, love being here in this nature preserve. As we jump into the 6th episode of the CultureRoad podcast, just know that we invite you to feel the whole South Florida vibe that we're in, including roosters, exotic birds. We got the whole thing going on, waterfalls. So please kind of enjoy the space and feel like you're part of the conversation. Today, the conversation is about something that is incredibly personal to me. It's around a philosophical discussion that I've been having with myself for many years, and also that I've been having sometimes even in confrontational ways over the last several months especially. And what I would love for us to do in this episode is think about some of the philosophical ways in which we approach equity, diversity, and inclusion. So I'll just give a little context here. I've been an equity, diversity, and inclusion practitioner for about 30 years. I kind of stumbled into this work, started off as an activist, and stumbled into this work with just a lot of passion in my heart about how it is that I can contribute to creating a more equitable world and trying to eliminate bias and oppression in the world wherever it exists. And I've been following that path as true to form as I can for the entirety of my life. Along the way, though, what that means is that I have created programs that haven't always been successful, or they haven't been successfully or effectively adopted, or that resources have shifted midstream through working with a client, or priorities have shifted, or recommendations that I or other EDI practitioners offer to oftentimes well-meaning executives or managers aren't actually incorporated into practice. And over 30 years, what we find is that accumulated frustration associated with not ever meeting the expectations that we've set out for ourselves, and still living in a world that's filled with equity or inequity, and also living in a world that continues to be filled with oppression. And now here we are after several years of really complicated focus on oppression and on inequity at the systems level, not just in the United States, but all across the globe, and really thinking about what is it that we are going to do to really create the world that we want to live in. And at this crossroads, the conversation that I continue to be confronted by is the work that we're doing related to equity, diversity, and inclusion authentic? Is it actually meaningful? Is there any chance that what we can do to change the world is going to be anything more than performative or anything more than incremental? Are we actually going to be able to create a space that we have been aspiring for decades and decades and decades, if not hundreds of years? And so this is the starting point, because one of the things that I've been confronted with is people to me, for much younger than me, oftentimes saying, listen, we don't care what you've been doing for the last 30 years. We need you to know that our philosophy is now's the time to just burn it all down and start over. And it's been hard. It's been a hard pill for me to swallow. It's not necessarily a position that I support. However, I understand the frustration, and I absolutely understand why it is that people have very little faith in some of the performative and also authentic, but not necessarily effective efforts that we've made to date. So this episode is really about kind of unpacking. What does that mean? Burn it all down. What are the options other than burn it down? What are the pros and cons of the approach of kind of burn it all down to the ground at a systems level and create something that is wholly built on a brand new model and by new people and new voices? And also, is there a path forward from here, even for people who might have different philosophical approaches? So, my friends, that's what we're starting for, this ridiculously complicated philosophical space that we've had plenty of conversations around, that we continue to have a lot of conversations around, that is continuing to be kind of unfolding on a day-by-day basis in the world that we're living in, where there's so many different voices and ideas and things continue to change. So I want us to just talk about this and talk about some of your perspectives and also what it is that we might look to as far as those of us who really care about this work, who really care about ending oppression in the world, who really care about creating more systems of equity and justice. What are the options? And to do it in a way that acknowledges that we're coming from different identities, different lived experiences, different generations, and bringing all of those like to the table as we have this conversation, because I really think there's going to be a lot of wisdom that we can use here, okay? So with that said, before we go any further, let's do introductions though. So Jayla, you go first, and then Lexi, tell us a little bit about yourself and why it is that you do work related to equity, diversity, and inclusion so we can get a little context.
Yeah, of course. So I'm Jayla Hodge. I was born and raised in Denver, Colorado, in Michigan and Chicago. But my background, it's pretty widespread. I have a background in journalism, political science, systems organization, as well as like a lot of activism in there as well. So that gives me a very wide perspective to look at this issue at. I've seen kind of both sides of these arguments, and I think I have a really good understanding of them and like where there's maybe more areas of tension and then more areas of understanding. So I'm excited for our conversation today.
Nice. Thanks, Jayla.
I am Lexi Seals-Johnson. I was born and raised in Utah and went to college there. So I have a background in higher education, diversity, equity, and inclusion, consulting, that sort of thing. I think Burn It Down is very interesting for me because I feel like I have a lot of privilege in knowing how to talk to people in power, right? In a way that makes others who are wanting to burn it down be understood. And so I think that's why I really love this topic. I'm very excited to get into it.
Nice. Yeah. Okay, let's jump in then. Yeah. Let's jump in. So I definitely have perspectives on how to frame this, but I've been talking about this for 30 years. Let's start off with you. Let's start off with you all telling us a little bit more about this, widespread philosophy. And for those of you who are just like trying to get a context around this, I'll give what I think is a super helpful analogy. I remember the last episode of Game of Thrones, right? Just like everyone remembers the last episode of Game of Thrones. And I remember Daenerys riding around on her dragon, literally burning everything down, burning it all down, right? And I remember just being like overwhelmed with emotion. And at the beginning, I was like, wow, that's a serious, like badass move. I was so like, I was feeling it. And then by the end of it, I was like, wait, what next? Like, do we have a plan? Like, what's gonna happen? Like, we're all just gonna be, those of us who actually survive it, standing in the ashes. Then what? Like, how do we build from there? And I remember that was like such a visceral moment for me to think about the idea of, I understand dismantling, but what I don't understand is like from that place of standing in the ashes, then what? And that's the place that I really wrestle with the idea of burn it down. Not that I don't understand things that are broken, but I really also am, maybe just hopelessly optimistic in the desire to figure out like what is it that we're going towards. So that's how, for those of you who are like trying to figure out conceptually what this topic is, maybe a potential starting point. But I'd love to hear from you all, like what it is that you all hear and how it is that you would describe this.
Yeah, so burn it down for me, I think makes a lot of sense to me because I think the people who believe that way are in a place where they don't see any other option and haven't had the experiences or privileges to feel like there can be any change. And I think it's just, for me, a place of exhaustion. Yeah. Just like working for so long and seeing your family work for so long to and try as hard as you can in doing the things that people are saying you need to do to be successful or to change the environment, and just not seeing any difference in that, like not seeing any difference being made. And I think that's totally valid, and I totally understand that. And I think that people like us who have had experiences and privileges to be in a world where we have access to people who can make a difference, for me, I see that as my privilege, working to understand and validate them and understand there's a place for them, while also knowing that my place is to have those conversations, because I haven't had to work as long and as hard as they have had to. That exhaustion hasn't set in for me yet, right?
Yeah.
And so for me, it's like, okay, I need to be the one to have those conversations so that they don't feel like they have to burn it down. But I don't think a lot of them think about the what next question. I don't think that that's a question. I think it's like, this isn't working and I don't know how to change it, so let's just get rid of it. And that's how I see it.
And I think like we gotta be cognizant that we're talking like very generally here. But I agree with what you said. I think it's coming from a place of people have like the language and knowledge of like abolition and abolishing systems that are only making like incremental changes. And they're, again, tired, exhaustion. They're like, we have to like get rid of, and they want it in a radical way, of the things that are oppressing people, are keeping us from this vision and view of like how things could be, but rapidly. And again, I think that's coming from when you have decades of people feeling oppressed, or like things aren't changing fast enough, are living on that side, and all of us with marginalized identities can fully understand that. But then the world that, a good example I'll say is like when I was an activist too, and I was younger and I hadn't seen this side, like this middle ground, I was very much like, yeah, we got to do away with all of that. Like I want it done now. Like my parents were oppressed. I don't want to keep living in the same cycles. And now that like I'm on like this side of being a DEI practitioner and we're working with individuals, I see that there's a lot of good intention within these like systematic incremental changes that is still building to that same vision and view, just in two different ways. And I think the good way to bridge that gap is that we all want the same outcome, right? A world without oppression, a world that's more equitable, a world that's more just. Our methods of getting there are different.
It's interesting. So it's interesting because, you know, both of you are describing people just being tired or exhausted, right? Which I totally get. But it seems to me like this sentiment is more coming from younger people. So where is this tiredness and exhaustion coming from in people who are so young, who are so new to the workforce, for example?
And I think it's exposure, because we are living in like the digital age. So we've seen I've had a phone, I think, since I was like 6. So we've seen growing up at a much younger age, we've been exposed to, again, the oppression and the brutality that a lot of marginalized communities face. And on a global scale, we see it much bigger.
Right. Yeah, I think it all goes back to technology and social media. Yeah. Whereas like in the 80s, something horrific would happen and does happen every day, but you don't see it on your page every day. You don't have to watch the video over and over and over again. You don't have to, see it when you're seeing it in your face that much. I think it just brings about a feeling of like, this needs to change. I also think a lot of it is like education, is knowing that we feel like we can rise up to the top, right? Whereas I think like a lot of people before us felt like, this is my place.
Yeah.
And like, this is where I have been, and this is where my family has been, and I feel good being here. Whereas I think a lot of others are like, no, I'm gonna be an innovator. Like we grew up in the age of technology. The whole point is to innovate and make new changes and grow, and fast. Technology is fast. So I think for us, it's like, we know it can be done fast.
Right.
And I think it comes from a mutual respect too, of like the generations before us who have done all of this work, who have like paved the way, and understanding like, we are now here, and we want to like push it even further.
Right.
Yeah, so I think it does come from like a place of respect of all like the activists and all of the innovators and glass breakers before us.
And it's interesting because like, radical ideas are not new. Radical ideas have been around for a very, very, very long time, right? It's like critical race theory. Like, this isn't brand new. This has been around for a long time. We're talking about it now, but it kind of seems like just generational cycles, right? It just, you know, like I'm officially like old enough to have lived through a couple of different generations at this point, where I saw this is the energy that I brought to my work when I was in my, you know, teens and 20s. And then I kind of watched after, you know, this lull, this big period of a lull. And now I'm watching this resurgence. And I wonder if like every generation has that. And so like some of the ideas about burn it all down are just kind of the natural ways in which new generations express themselves. But I don't want it to be that easily dismissed. Like, oh, this is just young. This is just what youth does, right? Without really taking heed to, no. There's something ridiculously substantive that people are calling for, and they're calling for it at a global level. And if we don't listen to it, we might actually be standing in the ashes, right? And then what?
And I agree. I think that, too, like the level of scrutiny there is overall. So before, even just like 10 years ago, when a crisis or PR from organizations, it wasn't as widespread, right? People aren't looking at leaders as much as they are today because we have access to. And I think that's what has led a lot more to, again, this notion, burn it down, let's change this, just because we're seeing a whole lot more, and we're seeing the actions of organizations internally on like an external way now.
Yeah,
I also think we're seeing that it can be done. Like, I think in previous generations, it was so slow to see like a Black woman owning her own company and making, like, moving up. Like, it happened, obviously, but people didn't acknowledge it, or it's pushed behind. And so I think for me, I'm like, DeEtta can build this and create this. And like Jayla, we were talking about it last night. She's like, in 10 years, like, this is where I want to be, you know, because we see that. Whereas I don't think you saw that. No. So for us, it's like, we see it, we know it can happen. So let's get it done now.
There's like an energy.
Like, we ain't got to wait 10 years.
But there's now an energy like, these are the barriers. These are the structural, systemic barriers that are like keeping us from doing that. And I think that it's honestly coming from a belief, because we have a very strong belief that we can do it. And I think that's a fire, and it comes off as burn it all down.
Yeah,
I love it. Okay, so when you say that there are structural systemic barriers that we're trying to like get rid of, what are they? Like, what are the structural systemic barriers that if we made them go away, we could have more equity?
Yeah, so I think a big one is capitalism, which I think is talked about a lot. And me and Jayla talk about a lot, and we've talked about. And I think there's a place where we see people taken advantage of in capitalistic ways. And I think when people hear anti-capitalism, they say, you can't do anything without money. And I think for me, anti-capitalism means you can't do anything without money, but you can make that money equitable. I don't think there's any place in which there needs to be a billionaire at the top and people can't feed their kids at the bottom. So like, I'm all for money. I want to get paid. I want you to get paid.
Yeah.
You know? Right. But I don't think there's a need for me to have so much more than someone who literally can't survive. And I think that that's a huge barrier. There's a barrier for education. People can't afford to go to school. If they do, they have debt.
Yep.
I think that's a huge barrier I see.
I agree. And I think that there's like a misconnotation, again, like, there's like political philosophical views that are going to be over here and way over here. But I think majority of people fall into the same middle boat. When we say like anti-capitalism, we mean our system as it is. Like, I'm against the bad parts of it, the parts where people have to work, like teachers have to work 2 jobs just to pay their bills, and that there's not a lot of language or focus on work-life balance, where people are just employees are seen as just another number, or just another role, and not like that human element. And I think that that's the part of the anti-capitalistic structure that a lot of us want to change. I don't think it's against like entrepreneurship, right? It's like, how can we focus on small businesses, on businesses from owners that are marginalized, that had to work a lot harder and compete a lot more, are from practices that aren't oppressive, are holding anyone down in order to make money. And when you paint it that way, you're like, oh yeah, like most of us fall in that boat.
Yeah. As a business owner, that's been one of the things that I've run into a lot when I'm having conversations with people who are like equity, diversity, and inclusion practitioners. And then all of a sudden we're having a conversation, internally, and somebody starts using the language anti-capitalism. And I'm like, whoa, wait, I'm a capitalist. Like I literally, in order to be an entrepreneur and live in the United States of America and have a for-profit business, which we do, this is not a 501c3, right? But then I am participating in a capitalist system, but I actually feel like that's great.
Right.
I actually feel like me being present here and people like me, right? People who are Black and brown and women founders and entrepreneurs and CEOs are actually disrupting the inequity in the system. And I feel like a lot of times the language is making people feel like you're either, part of the problem, or you don't even get what the issue is at all. And I'm like, well, actually, I feel like what I'm doing is disruptive in its own way. So, but it is interesting to think about like how our language oftentimes is not necessarily mutually understood, and it sometimes is so broadly used, right? Such a blanket statement that we're missing some of the nuances and some of the opportunities for actually achieving the results that we want.
Right.
Yeah. So I really think it's just like a matter of perspective. Doing more, and like the people in these organizations and in these businesses, like they don't care, and if they wanted to change it, they would. And then you enter it and you actually interact with the individuals. We hold facilitations, we talk to the C-suite, CEO, like we interact with them and engage with them, and then you start to see like, oh, they do care,
right?
And they are just a part, the same way that we all are kind of forced to function within the system, so are they. And the system has been around a lot longer than all of us. It is one that we grew into. And it's a lot harder to change it from there, and meeting people like where they're at.
Right.
And that was something that really had to change. But I definitely had friends who were like, oh, I'm surprised that was the route you took. And like you were much more radical. And some of it was very judgmental, and it was really hard for me. I had to sit there really and think about it. And I realized that, like, again, it's the intent.
Yeah.
And the intent is the same. It's just for those with a different path or ideal way to get there, they will see us as standing in the way, when in reality, we're not.
Yeah. I love when you're talking about like how it can be judgmental, and I feel like that's the part that's often the most hurtful for me, at least as an individual, is to know, like, this is ridiculously hard work. I mean, there's a lot of career paths that are so much more emotionally kind of agnostic. Yeah. This is like every single day we are like bringing our emotional A game. Like it's hard work otherwise, intellectually and physically and all of that. But emotionally, it's really, really heavy lifting. And to do it for this long and this earnestly and always trying our hardest to like show up in the service of others is a real commitment. And then to have some of the most judgmental relationships be with people who look just like us, or people who say, oh, who we feel like we should have the strongest affinity with, actually being the people who are the most judgmental. I feel like that's the part, and I don't disagree that we haven't, by any stretch of the imagination, made the progress that we wanted to, or else we wouldn't be up in arms. Like this, the world is on fire right now. We know that, right? But the world is on fire because we haven't made the progress we want and that we need. And so I absolutely support the fact that we need a serious intervention. Right. But philosophically, I also am like, wait, I don't feel like this is the time to judge each other. I feel like this is instead the time to like find different pathways towards the same goals.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's exactly what DI practitioners might be ignoring what's happening, but for us, we have to look at it
every day.
We can't ignore it because we have to sit with people in their pain, and acknowledge and research everything that's happening in the news. Right. So we can't ignore it. So I think that's a huge thing, and a lot of times that people don't see. But I totally think it's a listening thing. Like you don't listen, you don't pay attention, and you don't try to understand. Like what we are doing, right?
But if we scale back and like look at, I think it's again another generalization of the industry,
right?
Because I think about it before I met you, DeEtta, and I learned about DJ and saw that you have a very like systems way of approaching things. I don't also want to like pretend that like every person who claims to be an EDI practitioner or organization does that. And that's a harsh reality that like us as an industry has to face. It's very oversaturated. And again, that goes back to capitalism. Some individuals and people are looking at ways, how can I make money off of these practices?
Right.
And I'm not saying it's bad to make money, but they've made that the sole focus. And whether that's selling checklists or simply appealing to buzzwords or going in and reassuring people like, okay, you've done good enough. You can put our organization on your PR label that we came through here.
Yeah.
I think that's painting us all as bad.
And I think too,
that's actually a really good point.
That's a huge thing is we're in our retreat for DJA and DeEtta's like, let's all take a step back. Like, why are we here, right? I think that's a question we have to ask all the time, which I don't think a lot of people ask that. But for us, and why I feel so strongly about working with you and at DJA and with the people we do is because I fully and wholeheartedly believe that we're all actually trying to make change and difference. And I think that we would be doing it either way.
Yeah.
We would be.
You should be getting paid for doing the work you've been doing. However long, because a lot of times for generations, we've been doing the same work and not getting paid for it.
Right.
Exactly. So you might, we would be doing it either way. And so I think that
paying people for their value. And it's really interesting. I think this is the first time even sitting here conversing, I'm realizing like, that's the big difference. We truly believe in it. And even if we weren't getting paid, I deeply believe we'd all be still trying to make changes the way that we could.
Because we did. We have been. Our whole lives.
Yeah. So generalizations.
Yeah. It's interesting. I love having this. And it's also interesting because I feel like this conversation kind of keeps going, even when we think about, there's the EDI practitioner world that we live in. There's also people who are activists, for example. And there's a difference between being an activist and being more of a facilitators, right? That's what we are. We're facilitators, we're strategists. Activism is different. Activist is kind of right, wrong, good, bad. We spend more time kind of in the middle, kind of facilitating people moving along a developmental continuum, either individually or within their organization or within an industry or at a systems level. And I do feel like there's a ridiculously important place for that. But there's also, even inside of these other spaces like activism, these really specific and judgmental ways in which we expect our activists to live and exist. Right. And there are these old mental models like you have to be broke, you can't have any life or livelihood outside of your activism, you can't ever have fun or smile. Right? I feel like, those of us who have decided to do work that is really kind of mission driven in certain ways often have the additional burden of having to deal with the judgments for people who are like looking from the outside in and making judgments about whether this is the right path and also how we're doing it and how it is that we should be doing it. These kind of armchair quarterback relationships that we have, which is only another layer of burden and I think actually another layer of oppression.
Right. Yeah, it really is. And I think that I've been told okay, well the things you do aren't actually gonna change anyone's life or impact them, things like that. And we all who do this work every day, we realize it's an uphill battle in the fact that we all still show up and we're still trying to think of new, innovative ways to make a change.
Yeah.
Versus we always say transformation or what can we do better? What can we change? It's not like we're sitting here on the same practices, on the ideas. We're like, well, these made us money.
Right.
And I think it's the organizations, companies, people that do that, they deserve that scrutiny, but
yeah.
I think it's about learning who you're speaking to.
Right. And I have this conversation all the time. We can't all be Oprah Winfrey's. We can. And so I think I have this conversation a lot as I think a lot of people in our generation want to change the world. And I think we do that. I feel like my biggest life changers were teachers who no one will ever know their name, or were my coworker who no one will ever know their name. And so I think that's the biggest part of the uphill battle is we are transforming people. It might take us one person at a time or one person sitting in this facilitation at a time, but I've seen it even working at DJA for not very long is at the beginning of a course or a facilitation. They're like, I don't know why I'm here. You're going to make me tell me that everything I do is bad because I'm a white man and I can't do anything right. And then by the end, they're like, oh, like that's not at all what you're saying.
Right.
And I'm like, okay, that changes one person's life because now they are making decisions for other people, and like it's a chain of events.
There's no question. Yeah.
And like we have intersectionalities like of our identities, we also do of our beliefs. And I think this is a really good one where like, in a way, we are activists. Yeah. And in a way, we also are like this middle ground practitioner space, but we have to be like a foot in both to do it well.
Right.
And I recommend that people who are more activists come over to our side and be practitioners, because that's how we get fresh ideas and new perspectives, but vice versa.
Right.
It takes a little bit of both to move us along.
Yeah. And related to that idea of like activism is, we have to have opinions. We're not just agnostic, right? We do have values that we are firmly advocating for and pushing our clients towards. We are saying, no, there is actually something that is too exclusionary, and we're going to strongly recommend. We might not be able to boycott them or but we can say, we're going to steer you away from that, and we're also going to make sure that you clearly understand the consequences of not pursuing this more inclusive path or not pursuing this more equitable path. And so we still do, in many ways, kind of have our own way of being activists, but not necessarily in the same demonstrative sort of way. A lot of times it's us kind of shepherding people, oftentimes kind of quietly or subtly through their own decision-making process, but especially people who have a lot of power and authority who want to do right, but they don't always understand, and they need kind of a confidential guide to help them show up in the world the way that they want to. Right?
Because for a lot of people, especially those who make decisions, when you call them out, they shut down and don't listen. When you're in a room with them and your client slowly giving them ideas or shaping their view over time, that makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
And I mean, not to say that those call outs and those boycotts totally have a valid place, but I think for a lot of people, when they don't feel attacked, which some people should be attacked for some things they say, but when they're just trying to make a change in their workplace, I think that they are more willing to listen when they don't feel like they're being attacked, and it's like a full journey with you're learning together, right?
Yeah, we're like translators almost. That's what I feel like sometimes, because again, like our end goal, our mission, very similar, but we are speaking in a way that like might actually move people. And I really like that. I like that visual. We are guiding, and I think the difference between activism is demanding these organizations meet them where they're at versus we meet them where the organizations and the leaders are. And then we guide them along over here.
Yeah.
And that works. People do shut down. People do get defensive. It doesn't really cater an open, honest dialogue or transparency or even encouraging people to grow.
Yeah.
So
I do think that we live in a world where we need all of it, right?
Absolutely.
We need all of it. And but for our work to not be kind of part of that really important formula would be a huge absence. And also, I think that one of the other opportunities that we have and that we can talk about is, how do we create that path forward, right? Because that's the thing that is oftentimes getting in the way for people is they care, they're willing, they have the resources, they have the decision-making authority, but they just don't know, like, what is the end game? What are we actually trying to accomplish? What will it look like when we do it well? And then how do I get there?
Right.
And so maybe what we can do is after we take a word from our sponsors, we can come back and talk a little bit about if we talk about anchoring to aspiration, right? Which is one of my favorite phrases. We talk about what that can and should look like. What is that? What is the work of actually helping people understand what that aspirational new reality is, and then also what is the path for getting there? Okay? All right, so word from our sponsors. We'll be right back.
This episode is brought to you by CultureRoad, a live and on-demand digital learning solution powered by DeEtta Jones and Associates. CultureRoad is an easy-to-use subscription, delivering fresh content monthly and access to experts to help professionals at all levels thrive in the contemporary workplace. Stay up to date with best practices on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and acquire the necessary skills and tools to effectively lead, manage, and influence others. Get connected with our community of practice to further your professional development at CultureRoad.com.
So before break, we were talking about, different ideas associated with, the problems of, having judgmental affinity group members, people who actually share the same passion for equity and anti-oppression in the world, but who have different approaches to it and kind of judging each other and not necessarily supporting each other, as opposed to potentially building a shared path that's really positive. The other thing that is, absolutely acknowledged is that inequities do exist, and we have had a ridiculously hard time getting some of the changes that we want and need in the world. And it's necessary to have activism and intervention and disruption and radical ideas and behaviors and interrogation. And at the same time, for us, our work has been really about, trying to figure out how do we play that dual role, right? Kind of with the activist energy and ideological perspective about where it is that we want to go, that is absolutely driven by our inclusive values, right? It's not like we're agnostic, like anything's good, right? We actually care about what we're trying to do. But then we also are trying to figure out how do we help create space for people who are newer to this journey, or who have the ability and the desire to be part of something that is more inclusive and more equitable, but don't know how. And for me, that's the opportunity to really think about the idea of like anchoring to aspiration. And this phrase has been a phrase that I've just loved and been using for decades and decades. Well, not decades and decades, just one decade. I'm not that old. But it's really about, I think human energy is more motivated by the future and by the possibility of building something. I think humans are designed to build. Humans are designed to grow. Humans love having a vision that we can pursue, a vision for our life, a vision for our health, our happiness, our family, our children's happiness and well-being, our organizations, whatever it is, we love to build. We get tremendous intrinsic satisfaction from that. And so for me, I've always taken the philosophy of how do we find that aspirational destination and then use that to help compel people's energy individually and then collectively, rather than only spending time, solely spending time focusing on all the things that we haven't gotten right yet, or all the ways that we've had atrocities in our past. Those things are ridiculously present and need to be accounted for. But we also have to give people a path out of that. We have to say, okay, if all of these things were wrong, here's what right looks like, or here's what it could look like, or here's how it could be that we could build something that is better together. And here's not just what that vision is, which is a really compelling opportunity for people to start visualizing what it might look like and to see themselves in it, but also to figure out what are the steps that I personally might take or that my organization might invest in to help us get from here to there. And I feel like that's the place that I'm really compelled by. And I always have been, right? And it hasn't always been in fashion. A lot of times people have been like, you're too Pollyanna, or it's not gonna work, and all you get is incremental change. But I feel like over the years, I've had more positive success finding people who really want to be allies and advocates and mentors and sponsors than people who have shut me down and said, no, this is not something that's even palatable for us. So for me, that's where the anchor to aspiration idea comes into play. And I just wonder, I don't know if, coming from your points of view as people who are newer to your careers or have different identities and lived experiences, what do you think about that? Do you have any perspectives about, is anchoring to aspiration too Pollyanna? Is it too walking around with rose-colored glasses? Is it, we're past that point, we tried it, it didn't work, now we have to do something more disruptive? I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Oh, and it's such a big question. My brain is arguing two different sides because I truly see both points. I think that there's anchoring to aspiration, and we all know what that vision looks like. And part of me is gets excited about that and understands our baton race of almost getting there. And then another part of me is but if we all know what it looks like and we all know it's possible, why aren't we doing everything in our power to push it, to get it? But that is a really optimistic and idealistic view, because the reality is we aren't going to be able to change and make the changes we want by tomorrow. And that's not because there's a lack of will from us. It's because the system doesn't move that way. And so I'm more practical. I think where we stand in the realm that we work in is in a place of practicality, right?
Yeah, and I think the thing is, like, we know what that looks like, but I don't think everyone.
Yeah.
Like, I'm thinking as someone who's spent a lot of time in different spaces, is there's a lot of people who don't see a problem with the way that the world is right now. Like, and I think we like to think that that's not a big of a piece as it is, but I think that, or our view of that is much more radical than what others might be. And so I think for me, I do think I understand and probably definitely am in that space, but I do think that the radical view of it has brought a lot of attention to the problems, right? Yeah. Like, and I think that's why I think that there totally is a valid space for, like you said, we have to acknowledge that, and there's a space for people who have a different approach to it. But I think the way that we all see that, like you said, is more practical, and also understanding that both of those a lot of times have to work at the same time. Right? Like there have to be people outside trying to break it down, and there have to be people inside trying to tell people why they're trying to break it down, right? And that's like my view of it is I am trying to help them understand why people are trying to break it down. Yeah. And if you don't want them to break it down, then we have to do something about it, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the question that people don't understand is you are mad that they're trying to break it down, but if you don't want that to happen, then you have to make change, right?
I see, like, in my head, I really do see it. You guys are starting to tell. I really envision things. But like we have like the bulldozer, and it's like knocking down the building, one swoop, like let's just get rid of it. And then there is us, and we are literally dismantling it, but brick by brick. And as we take one brick down, we are intentionally, carefully placing another one there. Right. And we have an overall vision. We are building too. We know exactly kind of how we want to get there. So it's a more step-by-step process. But I wouldn't say it's any less radical. Yeah. Like, 'cause we do want like transformative change, right?
Yeah.
And we do want structures that are completely different, and practices that have really not been done before are set precedent to. So I think that there's a balance there. It is closer to what we think.
Yeah. It's interesting when you say that, because it's like it's working, like it's instead of like demolishing the system, to think about ways to work within a system. I don't know if it has to be that binary, but it is interesting to think about, like within some of the organizations that we work with, right? So think about some of the organizations where we work, and they have, long-standing identities and brands that have been, celebrated, where they are seen as, top tier, best in class, world renowned, whatever it is. Think about higher education, think about in corporations, whatever the industry is. We definitely work with clients like that. And they want to take their brand and their identity to the next stage. They don't want to wipe away their brand and identity. And the tricky part is that along with their brand and identity, oftentimes comes a lot of exclusionary either practices and or experiences that people have had, because they've made it really hard for people to work there, or they've made it really hard for people to get into school there, or they've made it really expensive for people to be able to actually go to school there and not have so much debt coming out that it's not upside down for years and years and years. And so for us to try to figure out, like, how is it that we can take some of those things that have allowed that institution to be successful, and then also incorporate for them additional models and voices that are going to be kind of next generation for the way that they see themselves, and it will keep their brand and their identity and their positioning in their industry strong, but will be absolutely reconceptualizing the how of how they show up, right? And the little threads that are often kind of the invisible things that are really transformational. That's where our work often lies. Like, a lot of times people see us as facilitating or talking or workshops or courses or whatever. And that's some of it. But some of the most transformational things that we actually do are about like policy change. Like, how is it that your policies and your processes and your criteria for advancement are going to be interrogated and adding an equity lens to them in order to allow for more women or more people of color or more people who from non-traditional employment experiences to be considered and advanced? How is it that you can apply equity lenses so that everyone in your organization, not just the diversity officer or not just this committee, actually now is equipped to be able to make sure that they're advocating and being real sponsors to make sure that the advancement that they seek in the organization is possible? And those kinds of things that really require like careful, nuanced involvement within the system, that's a lot of the oftentimes invisible work, but to me that's real transformational work. It's like at the nitty-gritty systems level, we're really trying to infuse new ideas and new practices in ways that are scalable and integrated and sustainable, and in ways that are demonstrable, so that they don't disappear, right? When they're all of a sudden they don't go out of style.
And I think those two things work together really well. And I have a higher ed background, so that's always where my head goes. But I think I've been in a lot of institutions where they want to recruit diverse populations. And my argument was always, don't recruit diverse populations if when they get here, they have no support. And so I think that's where those two things come together, is those classes create a space where when you change the policy to get more voices in the room, they have a safe space to have their voices heard, And so for me, like, I know this in real world has been huge because I have never worked in a place where I had been able to talk about my wife. Like, I last year got married and I was so excited to talk about it, but in my previous places of work, I didn't feel comfortable talking about it, And so I came to DJA and I'm like, people are so excited and they're sending me wedding gifts and I can talk about it and it's so fun. And because I can bring that identity to the workplace, I feel like I can do a better job, And so I think that's where those two things come together, is because you have the policy that brought me from Utah somehow into your organization. And then I came here and felt welcomed and like I was in a safe space is the key. I think that's a huge key.
And then continuing to scaffold that, because most organizations, have hundreds, if not thousands, of either policies and or practices that, sometimes they're documented, but sometimes they're more formal or not, that actually create access for people or roadblocks, And then how is it that we help our clients and help other organizations understand that that's the place where real equity lives? Like, you really want to disrupt and be radical in the weeds. Equity lives in the details, Equity lives in those little details. There are big things. You can knock down the whole house, but what are you going to build? What are you going to build? But to actually say all of these things, like these advancement policies that I actually talked to a client several years ago that had a very, very significant lack of representation of women in the C-suite level. And they just could not figure out how to get women to kind of director level and above in their organization. And they've been wrestling with this for years, and it had been very heavily prioritized, but they could not figure out what the problem was. And I asked them about all of their advancement processes and policies, and all to a person, they said that they had really created them very carefully, and they all used the word objective. Every single person I talked to said, oh, they're really objective. We really spent a lot of time doing it. I was like, can I take a look? And I took a look and I was like, how come this uninterrupted ability to travel internationally is part of this? And so think about it. Disproportionately, women are the one who actually have children and or are childcare providers, primary childcare providers, disproportionately speaking. And so this ability to just travel year after year on these international trips that are 10 days or 2 weeks or a month or 6 weeks for this intensive experience is not an option for a lot of women for all sorts of practical reasons. And they could not see that. And but those are the things, and there's millions of those that exist in the world, where if we could actually get in and start figuring out ways to do that focused work in more detailed and scalable ways that become really integrated and sustainable practices over time, we really can transform organizations. At the same time, we need to continue to develop our skills. We need to create strategy. We need to continue doing that work. But there's a lot of that actual systemic work that could be really, really powerfully done and is really being powerfully done, but that may not be as easy to see and as kind of sexy and glamorous to describe as something that seems like a bigger kind of emphasis on calling out an entire industry or calling out something that's broken.
Yeah, and I think that's another thing is like, you can burn it all down, but those people will still be there and they still won't know how to create a safe place.
They won't know what to do.
They don't know. It doesn't, like, it takes the structure down, but then they're still there not knowing what they did wrong or how to change it. They should know what they did wrong, but they won't, right? They'll just, so I think that's why it's such an important place.
Yeah, and I know people critique like, okay, well, all you guys do is teach, all you do is teach. And that's definitely not all that we do. But it is such an important part because if we don't teach people how to be different, they won't be. And like, I've never quite understood like why that was such a critique against us when like learning is the only way that we can move forward.
Well, it's kind of the way that I think about accountability. There's so many, and this has always been the case, but we oftentimes call for people to be held accountable. Not just now, always. This has always been a case. We want our leaders to be held accountable. We want people to be held accountable for their behaviors. The tricky part is that I believe that accountability begins at the beginning, not at the end. Oftentimes we're trying to hold people accountable after they've done something wrong. And by the way, we never told them what the bar was. We expected them to know it. And maybe in hindsight, if they looked back on it and they had kind of the lenses that we have on it, maybe they would have done things differently. But it's really hard to actually hold a person accountable in a way that is going to punish them and also turn into a learning as in they're going to do something differently in the future, right? To me, that's the whole point. It's not just about punishing people and making an example of people. It's about equipping people with the tools and the behaviors for actually doing it better in the future, right? So to just tell people you did it wrong and make them embarrassed to ever make that mistake again, just means that we're cutting off a potential additional ally or sponsor, right? And so for me, I feel like this accountability call has to be coupled with the opportunity to say, let's talk about what the bar is, right? That educational piece. And then let's make sure that you have the developmental expectations, tools, and then milestones for crossing that bar. Right.
And I think it's starting earlier and earlier. I'm thinking, I have two nephews who I love so much, and they're growing up in the same small town I did. But for me, when I get them a present, I always get them like a book that has like all like families look all different things, where those books didn't even exist when we were kids. And so, which like, that's not a huge age gap, like it's a few decades, right? And so it's like that learning is huge, even from like a developmental phase, right? For when my nephews will see a book with two moms or a grandma who is the caretaker, where I never saw that. So for me, it wasn't even an option. And so I think that's where like learning then, like they get to learn that when they're children, whereas we didn't. So now you have to learn that sometime, right?
And we take like the same idea and look at our own industry. I have a father, he's a lot older, he's 75, but he was alive. He entered the workforce in 1969, literally the last year of civil rights. And his work, even though the language wasn't there at the time, was considered the first like diversity practitioner who's brought in by a major corporation that thousands and thousands of people globally, and they only had 6 Black employees, and he was one of them. And when I was in my very, I'd say more radical youth, he would always like correct me and remind me that like, you can do what you do. You can even see that vision and that future because of the work that I did. And not only activists that we talk about, but the people who actually went into these organizations and in a much harder time and laid the foundation. He loves to remind me that you have a job because I did the work, so your boss has a company.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
DeEtta Jones and Associates is here because the work I did.
Yes.
Right.
I should thank your father too. Thank you. Thank you.
And when you look at it like that, I think it's a good way of like retrospectively understanding like, yeah, there's different things that we as an industry practitioners could have done better, but we didn't know that at the time.
Right.
At any given time, I like to believe that we're all just doing the best we can.
Right, and know how to do.
Yeah, and adapting and changing and growing as we go through this journey.
Right.
Right. And we're doing it authentically. Right. That's the thing that's super important is, and I'm glad that you even mentioned that conversation that we had during our retreat, which, you know, where it was like, hey, you know, let's just make sure we're on the same page. We're not just here making sure that our operational efficiencies are in order. We're here because we're philosophically aligned.
Right.
Like, we're actually trying to change the world.
Yeah.
Right. And it's pretty amazing to wake up every day and be able to be surrounded by people who are trying to change the world. But it's exhausting.
Yeah.
Right. And it's hard. It's like pushing a rock uphill with your nose. Right. It's Sisyphean in a lot of ways. So it's really cool to be able to like have these spaces where we talk about our philosophical alignment, and also where we can kind of support each other in like, okay, this is where we're trying to go. Let's remember what the vision is, right? And then figure out how we support each other on that path.
Where our accountant's like, that's great. I love that you're making the world a better place, but we all need a paycheck to go. We're just trying to change the world.
We're just trying to change the world. She's like, okay, Daddy.
That's very, very true. Yeah, it's a very cool space to be in.
Yeah.
It is.
And it's a cool time to be here. I know it also seems like, you know, just because there's so much disruption in the world right now, it's for a lot of people, it's a really scary time and a really scary place. As much as I feel that, and I have definitely been scared, I also am more excited.
Yeah.
You know, I feel like all of my life's work and effort and experiences are finally being focused on right now. And it's a degree to which we actually get all that we're looking for, I don't know. But the energy that I have for continuing every single day to like give it my A game is so high. I'm just so excited that I get a chance to be alive during this moment in time where the whole world is coming together and caring about the kinds of issues that are really going to allow us to have a transformational experience. I don't know what it's going to look like on the other end, but I'm determined to be part of it.
Yep.
And the shift is really, really exciting.
And you can feel the energy.
Yeah.
We definitely can collectively. And I think that even talking about go watch our past episode. We talked about the metaverse. It's really good. It's a little plug. But we're building literally new worlds, and new ways of working, and new ways of showing up and engaging. And the fact that in the past, even talking about diversity, equity, inclusivity, anti-oppression, all that would have been something done retrospectively. The fact that it's just proactively, like the forefront of everything, like that's what I anchor to. That's my aspiration.
I love it. I was just going to ask that. We are officially winding down. So I was going to ask, like, what is it that you're anchoring to? What is your aspiration? So when you talk about the fact that we're actually building a new world, an example like the metaverse, that's a really great example. What about you, Lexi? What do you
I think mine is, I'm obsessed with my nephew, so I'm going to bring them up. But the fact that the things that I do every day will make a place for them to show up authentically so much earlier than we ever were able to. Like, I think especially as three women who went to college in like very white spaces, I didn't even go to work with natural hair until like this year. DeEtta's like, oh, look at your hair. I'm like, I know, I didn't know I could wear my hair like this, right? I was told like straight hair is professional, right? So I think just being in a space where doing the work I do every day makes it a better space for the younger people to just be able to show up authentically today and not have to wait to do it until they're older, right?
Right.
I know I already kind of answered, but I think you'll like this point. This is one I kind of learned from DeEtta. It's like, regardless of title, whether it's activist, DI practitioner, or just no title at all, I think I meet and engage with people every day on all levels of lots of identities who really care. And I think they are really well-intentioned. And I see that more often than not. Like, the intention is there.
Yeah. I'm anchoring to the fact that there's this global community of people who are really pulling in the same direction. We have a long way to go, but I actually feel really hopeful. I feel far more hopeful than lacking hope. I can see, and because of technology and because of globalization, I actually can see firsthand, all of these different voices and all the different ways in which people are willing to kind of show up, and all the different innovations that people are bringing to try to create more equity in the world. And it makes me ridiculously excited. It also makes me ridiculously excited to have, and this is for me, at this point in my career, the opportunity to have folks like you, where I'm like, you know what, I've been going hard for a long time, and it's really nice to be able to just kind of pull back and be like, yep, there are voices and out there and people who are philosophically aligned, who are doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Not to say I'm not going to continue to do heavy lifting, but to know that there's a whole lot of us that are coming from many different spaces who are doing this is really heartening. So, all right, my friends, we did it. End of episode. Good conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, we are done. That is our episode on burning it down versus anchoring to aspiration. We hope that you left inspired. We hope that we peppered you with some ideas about thinking about your own philosophy and how you can bring that to your personal practice and also to your organization. And we would look forward to seeing you for our next episode of Culture Road Podcast.